put people, if they offered life in prison, they'd have less death sentences. Less death sentences. It doesn't seem fair that, like, you're talking about, like, justice for the victim. Well, the victim's already dead. But the problem is when you have the death penalty in a system that can never be perfect because humans are imperfect, that you're going to have innocent people die. And when you do that, you have a second victim. You created a second victim that isn't taking back the life of anyone who was killed by a murderer, just killing more people. And it doesn't really make sense that you can just talk about the bad things that happen to people that are murdered, but ignore the things that happen to people that are innocent.
Conveniently bracketed to the side in favor of more moralistic arguments or distorted out of existence by statistical manipulation. For instance, my opponent walked us through the entire appeals process as if the execution of appeals somehow makes it proof positive that this person committed this crime. How do appeals mean a thing when 95% of people on death row couldn't afford a competent attorney to defend them at any point throughout the process? To cast these issues aside and just pretend that they do not exist is philosophically uninteresting, argumentatively unethical, and politically irresponsible. We cannot afford to bracket these issues to the side. Capital punishment is an expression of the society we live in. The world we have offered you today is perhaps a more difficult pill to swallow. It means admitting that we do live in an unjust society, where black people are punished more harshly than white people, where poor people are punished more harshly than wealthy people. But statistical data that our opponents have really made no serious effort to call into question proves that the system works in this way. This is not a fact that we can imagine out of existence. I would also speak to the initial point of information, the description of the Cameron Todd Willingham case. And this is very typical of the pro-death penalty argument. You can paint this picture of portraying someone as some sort of monster, a jerk, whatever. I mean, Cameron Todd Willingham does not need to be a, quote, good person in order to be innocent of murder. The facts in the case, and it was the Innocence Project, led by Barry Scheck, that enlisted the leading arson experts in the nation to launch an investigation proving that an arson did not even take place. So while I can support Willingham's concern about his dartboard, sure, that doesn't show us that he is guilty of any crime. So at the end of the day, we can't wish racism away and try to get rid of it. And finally, I would like to call into to account some of their statistical questions, their argument that crime rates in Texas actually went up as a result of abolishing the death penalty. In fact, crime in Texas increased by 4%, almost 5 times the national average in 2001, while homicides increased by 7.6% at a rate of 6.7 per 100,000. Ultimately, they are distorting statistics beyond recognition in service of a more gut-level, retributive, and vengeful agenda.
Hey everyone, my name is Curtis. I hope we're all having a terrific evening. Alright, so the method to not be made of our justice system is to play social engineer. To punish blacks and whites and Hispanics and the rich and the poor, all in proportion to their respective percentages in the population. That would not only be asking too much, but would sacrifice the intrinsic value of justice in the name of the extrinsic value of equality. As a conservative, I believe that any government program, including the death penalty, ought to warrant suspicion, and so I applaud efforts to make our justice system even more accurate and even more efficient. It does not follow, however, that the death penalty should be abolished. It's not just a conservative idea, but a Western one, that life is precious, and the flagrant taking of a life deserves retribution, not just for the sake of deterring future murders, but so that we acknowledge some assaults on human life, like that of Jennifer Erdman and Elizabeth Pena, are so horrendous, so revolting, that the perpetrator cannot possibly be allowed to live. To be in favor of the death penalty does not mean you have to embrace racial and income inequality, nor does it mean you have to embrace a totalitarian state, nor does it even mean you must approve of every action taken in every court in every town of every state in this country. To be in favor of the death penalty means only to believe that some crimes are so monstrous that the criminal in question deserves to forfeit his life. Thank you.
Campaign to End the Death Penalty will ask a question to the other side from the Young Conservatives of Texas, and they will have 2.5 minutes to respond to that question.
overachiever, lawyer, and an author recently released a novel called Back from the Dead, in which she chronicled the lives of men all over the country, including Texas, who were released from death row in 1973 when the Supreme Court issued a decision in Furman versus Georgia saying that the death penalty in the United States had been applied arbitrarily and could not be sustained as a constitutional punishment. She follows the lives of many of the men who were released from death row all over the country. She finds that only one of those men committed another crime. The rest were successfully integrated back into society, contributed to their communities, and supported their families. One of the men committed a crime, again, was sent back to Texas death row and was eventually executed. That man had serious, severe mental illness. Because of that mental illness, could never have been reintegrated back into society on his own. My question, the first part of my question to the young conservatives of Texas, is in light of this long study, which I understand it might be tempting to simply call me a liar, as you have with our side on our evidence that Cameron Todd Willingham was indeed innocent. It may be tempting to do that, but for 1 second, give me the benefit of the doubt that I am telling the truth, that...
Point of order.
Point of order, that the word liar was never stated in that slanderous offense.
They said repeatedly that we had no evidence that Cameron Todd Willingham was innocent.
Your question.
The word liar was never stated.
Right. And you don't need to respond to that. You can just continue with your question.
My question, the first part of my question is, in light of the fact that only one of the men released from death row all across the country, hundreds of men released from death row, only one committed crimes. Again, how does that fit into your narrative that these men are depraved monsters who cannot be rehabilitated, who must be exterminated from the human race? My second part is, in light of your concern for the innocent members of our society, who I would posit many are jerks, just like you imagine Cameron Todd Willingham to be, and by your definition may not be so innocent after all, but I will give you the benefit of the doubt that everyone that hasn't been convicted of a crime is an innocent individual, even though you seem to think differently. In light of your concern for the innocent members of our society, if you were to be given evidence, weighty, persuasive evidence.
This was intended to be a question towards the side, being answered in 2.5 minutes. It's taken over 5 minutes to question.
Right. Anyway, if you could just finish.
I don't have a time limit on my questions, thank you.
A gentleman's agreement that it would be to the point.
And I'm not a gentleman, thanks.
Anyway, if you could just continue with your question, we'll get right back to the response.
I would like, if you received weighty, very...
I'd like to answer the second part of that question just because it's the only part I really remember. I think that the problem with the second part of your question is that you assume the value done to the families isn't in proportion to the value that your social programs would do. I think that we would argue that the benefit done to the victims' families and the benefit that is done to society in general and recognizing that such crimes are so repugnant, I think that would outweigh any benefit that your social programs would bring about.